They were told to expect brutality, starvation, and shame. But when 312 German women arrived at Camp Ruston, Louisiana in December 1945, the American nurse handed them small white packages they'd never seen before. "For your monthly cycle," she explained in broken German. The women stared in confusion. Monthly cycle? These weren't bandages. They weren't rags. They were something called sanitary napkins. Individually wrapped, clean, disposable. For women who'd spent years using newspaper and scraps of cloth, this small gesture of dignity would shatter everything they'd been taught about the enemy. If you want to hear more untold stories from World War II that reveal the shocking humanity hidden beneath the propaganda, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe right now. These stories challenge everything you thought you knew about the war, and they matter more than ever today. December 1945. The war had been over for 7 months, but these women had been trapped in a strange limbo, neither prisoners of war nor free civilians, waiting in overcrowded British holding camps for months before being shipped across the Atlantic. The train rattled through Louisiana countryside, carrying 312 German women toward an unknown fate. Through dirty windows, they watched endless flat fields pass by, cotton fields stripped bare after harvest, pine forests stretching to the horizon, small towns with white churches and general stores. Everything looked alien, foreign. This wasn't the bombed-out landscape of Europe. This was America, untouched and impossibly vast. These women weren't soldiers. They were Blitzmetal, lightning girls, the female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, radio operators, clerks, telephone switchboard workers, weather forecasters, and administrative assistants. Their ages ranged from 19 to 52. Most had joined voluntarily, believing they were serving their country. Some had been conscripted in the final desperate months of the war. Now they were classified as prisoners of war, even though they'd never fired a shot. Their clothes hung on thin frames. The gray-green Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms they'd worn for years were threadbare, buttons missing, seams splitting. Their hair, once kept neat according to regulations, was limp and dull from months of poor nutrition. Many had skin problems, rashes, infections, sores that wouldn't heal. None had seen a dentist in years. Their feet ached in worn-out boots. The train slowed as it approached Camp Ruston. Through the windows they could see guard towers, barbed wire fences, rows and rows of wooden barracks painted a dull olive green. American soldiers with rifles stood at attention. The women's hearts raced. This was a prison. A real prison. Not a holding camp or a transit facility, but a place designed to contain enemies. A woman named Margaret, 28, who'd worked as a radio operator in Berlin, gripped the wooden seat in front of her. She'd been captured by British forces in May 1945 and had spent months in a muddy camp in Belgium, sleeping on straw, eating watery soup twice a day. She'd lost 20 pounds. She'd lost 3 teeth. She'd watched women around her give up hope and simply stop eating, stop moving, stop living. Now she was in America, the enemy nation, the country that had bombed her city into rubble, the place where she expected to face the consequences of Germany's defeat. She didn't know what those consequences would be, but propaganda had painted vivid pictures of American cruelty. The train doors opened and the smell hit them first. Pine trees, sharp and clean, damp earth, and underneath it all, something that made their stomachs clench with longing, food cooking, bread, coffee, something with meat. After months of starvation rations in British camps, the aroma was almost painful. The sound was different from anything they'd experienced. Not the chaos of war-torn Europe, not the harsh efficiency of British military camps. Instead, they heard Southern American accents, slow and musical, so different from the clipped English they'd been hearing for months. Truck engines idled. A radio played jazz music somewhere in the distance. Birds sang in the pine trees. It was almost peaceful. The sight was overwhelming. American soldiers lined up in formation, but their posture was relaxed, almost casual. They didn't look angry or vengeful. They looked bored, like this was just another routine assignment. The camp was organized but not oppressive. Buildings in neat rows, paths swept clean, a water tower rising above it all. Electric lights were already coming on as evening approached. The December air was cool but not freezing, nothing like the brutal European winter. The women felt it on their skin as they stepped off the train, that strange Louisiana temperature that was neither warm nor truly cold. Some of them had been bracing for Arctic conditions, not knowing that the American South was mild compared to Germany. But what struck them most was the abundance. Even here in a prison camp, they could see evidence of wealth. Real glass windows in the barracks, metal roofs instead of canvas, paved roads instead of mud. America's power wasn't just military, it was economic, infrastructural, total. Frozen apprehension gripped the women as they lined up on the train platform. American officers called out orders in English, and translators repeated them in German. Form 2 lines. We will process you by alphabetical order. Move forward when your name is called. Processing. That word sent chills through them. They'd heard what processing meant in camps, inspections, humiliations, degradations. Many of the women had already endured delousing procedures in British camps that had been brutal and dehumanizing, stripped naked in cold rooms, sprayed with chemicals, their hair cut short or shaved completely. Greta, a 22-year-old telephone operator from Hamburg, started to shake. Her hands trembled so badly that she clasped them behind her back to hide it. She'd heard the stories. Every woman had. Stories about what happened to German women in Allied custody, stories that were partly propaganda, partly truth, and entirely terrifying. An older woman, Frida, 52, who'd worked in military administration, stood with her jaw clenched. She'd survived the war. She'd survived the British camps. She would survive this too. Whatever the Americans did to her, she would endure with dignity. Beside her, a young woman named Anna, barely 19, whispered prayers under her breath. She'd only been in the auxiliary service for 6 months before the surrender. She'd joined because her father told her it was her duty. Now she was an ocean away from home, about to be imprisoned by the enemy, and she wanted her mother with an intensity that made her chest ache. An American officer stepped forward. He was young, maybe 30, with a kind face that didn't match their expectations of the enemy. He spoke in careful, slow German with a heavy accent. "Welcome to Camp Rustin. I know you are afraid. I know you have heard terrible things about what will happen to you here. I am here to tell you the truth. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will have food, shelter, medical care, and basic dignity. We are not here to punish you. We are here to hold you until repatriation is arranged." The words were nice. But the women didn't believe them. How could they? They'd been lied to so many times, by their own government, by British officials, by everyone. Why would Americans be different? But as they shuffled forward into the processing building, something strange happened. The American military personnel, both men and women, were professional but not cruel. They were efficient but not harsh. There were no shouted insults, no rough hands, no deliberate humiliations. Wait, this wasn't what they'd expected. The fear lingered, but cognitive dissonance was creeping in. If the Americans were monsters, why were they being so normal? The processing building was warm. That alone was shocking. Heated buildings, in a prison camp. The women filed into a large room with tables set up in rows. American military personnel, both male and female, sat behind the tables with clipboards and forms. Each woman approached a table when her name was called. Basic information was recorded: name, age, hometown, occupation, military service record. The questions were straightforward, asked without hostility. The Americans seemed more interested in documentation than interrogation. Then came the medical screening. This was what the women had been dreading most. But instead of the brutal, humiliating process they'd endured in British camps, they were directed to a separate building where American female medical staff waited. A nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Johnson greeted them in halting German. She was perhaps 35, with a competent, no-nonsense manner. "We need to check everyone for illness and injury. This is for your health and safety. Female medical personnel only. You can keep your undergarments on." The examinations were professional and quick. Temperature checks, throat inspections, heart and lung examinations with a stethoscope. The nurses looked at skin conditions, checked for lice, examined feet for infections. They made notes but didn't judge. They applied antiseptic cream to sores without comment. They gave vitamin pills to those showing signs of malnutrition. Margareta couldn't believe it when the nurse treating her actually explained what she was doing. "Your gums are bleeding because of vitamin C deficiency. These pills will help. Take one every day with breakfast." It was such a small thing, explaining, treating her like a person who deserved to understand her own health. But after months of being processed like cattle, it felt revolutionary. The nurses discovered that many of the women had serious medical issues from months of deprivation. Anemia was widespread. Dental problems were universal. Several women had untreated infections. One had a broken bone in her foot that had never been set properly. Another had a severe vitamin deficiency that was affecting her eyesight. Instead of ignoring these problems or treating them as inconveniences, the American medical staff made detailed notes and created treatment plans. "We'll get you to the dentist next week," one nurse told a woman with an abscessed tooth. "For now, here's something for the pain." Pain medication, freely given. The German women couldn't process it. In their experience, medical resources were precious and reserved for those who were useful. They were prisoners, enemies, defeated. Why were they receiving medical care at all? After the medical examinations, the women were directed to another room for hygiene supplies distribution. They had no idea what this meant. In British camps, hygiene supplies had meant a bar of harsh soap shared among 50 women. But here, each woman was given an individual package containing 1 bar of soap, 1 toothbrush, tooth powder, a comb, a small towel, and, most mysterious of all, a white box with writing in English. Lieutenant Johnson held up one of the boxes in front of the group. "These are sanitary napkins," she explained in her careful German, "for your monthly cycle. Each box has 12 pads. You can get more from the medical station when you need them. They're disposable. You don't wash them, you throw them away after use. The women stared in complete confusion. Disposable? Throw them away? What did that mean? Why would you throw away perfectly good cloth? Margaret opened her box with trembling fingers. Inside were 12 individually wrapped packages, each containing what looked like a thick white pad with a long tail on each end. She'd never seen anything like it. How did it work? Where did it go? Greta whispered to the woman next to her. Are these bandages? For wounds? Anna thought they might be something to do with gas masks or chemical protection. The wrapper had English writing she couldn't read. Lieutenant Johnson saw the confusion and realized the problem. These women had never seen modern sanitary products. In Germany, even before the war, most women used reusable cloth pads or simply folded rags. During the war, even those had become luxuries. Women had resorted to using newspaper, scraps of uniform, anything absorbent they could find. The concept of a disposable sanitary product, something you used once and threw away, was beyond their experience. It represented a level of abundance they couldn't comprehend. Why would any society waste resources on something disposable when reusable options existed? Lieutenant Johnson called for a German-speaking nurse, Corporal Helen Braun, who was actually a German-American from Wisconsin. Helen explained in perfect German, demonstrating with a pad on the outside of her uniform. You see these long ends? These are wings that pin to your underwear. The pad sits in the middle. When you're done with it, you wrap it in the paper it came in and put it in the trash. Then you use a new one. Pin to your underwear. Disposable. Trash. Every word was foreign to their reality. But why not wash and reuse them? Frida asked, genuinely confused. This seems wasteful. Helen smiled gently. In America, we have enough that we don't need to reuse these. You deserve clean, sanitary products. This is better for your health. No infections from reused rags. The women looked at each other. America had so much abundance that they threw away perfectly good items after one use. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about sanitary products. This was about the vast gulf between German poverty and American wealth. Over the next few hours, as women figured out how to use the products, there were both laughter and tears. Laughter at the absurdity of not knowing how to use something American teenage girls took for granted. Tears at the realization of what they'd been living without, at the simple dignity of clean, disposable products designed specifically for women's needs. Anna held the sanitary napkin in her hands and began to cry. For years, she'd dealt with her monthly cycle using whatever scraps she could find, newspaper that chafed and fell apart, pieces of torn uniform that she'd wash in cold water and hide to dry. She'd felt ashamed, dirty, unable to properly manage something that should have been simple, and now the enemy, the Americans she'd been taught to hate, were giving her a solution wrapped in individual packages, clean and dignified. They care more about our monthly cycles than our own government did, she whispered to Margaret. It was a small thing, just menstrual products. But it represented something much larger. The idea that women's basic biological needs mattered, that dignity was a right, not a privilege, that even prisoners deserved proper sanitary care. From the hygiene distribution, they were taken to shower facilities. The women braced themselves for humiliation, forced group showers, harsh chemicals, degradation. That's what they'd experienced in British camps. Instead, they found individual shower stalls with curtains. Private. Each stall had hot and cold running water, a shelf for soap and shampoo, hooks for towels. There was actual water pressure, actual temperature control. Margaret entered her stall and turned on the hot water. Steam rose. The water was genuinely hot, not lukewarm, not rationed to 30 seconds, but available for as long as she needed. She stood under the stream and felt months of grime, of fear, of despair washing away. She used the soap, real soap that lathered properly, that smelled clean instead of caustic. She washed her hair for the first time in months, working out the tangles, feeling it become soft instead of stiff with dirt and oil. The water ran brown at first, then gray, then finally clear. Around her in other stalls, women were having similar experiences. Some were crying. Some were laughing. Some were silent, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of hot water and privacy. When they emerged, clean towels waited, not thin, ratty things, but actual terry cloth towels that were soft and absorbent. And beyond the towels, clean clothes. Simple cotton underwear, new still in packages. Cotton undershirts, loose-fitting blue work dresses, thick socks, and sturdy shoes that actually fit. The clothing wasn't uniforms. There were no swastikas, no Nazi insignia, no marks of shame, just plain practical clothes that were clean and whole. Each woman was given 2 complete outfits so she could wash one while wearing the other. Greta looked down at herself in clean clothes for the first time in months and didn't recognize her own body. She looked like a person, not a prisoner. She looked like someone who mattered. Clean and dressed, the women were taken to a mess hall. The building was large, warm, and brightly lit. Long tables with benches stretched in rows. Electric fans circulated warm air, and at the front of the room, serving lines were set up with American military personnel dishing out food. The smell was overwhelming. Bread, real bread, freshly baked. Coffee, actual coffee, strong and hot. Something with meat, vegetables. The scent hit their empty stomachs like a physical blow. Each woman was handed a metal tray and directed through the serving line. American soldiers and civilian workers filled their trays without comment, without judgment. A scoop of mashed potatoes, a piece of fried chicken, green beans, a slice of bread with butter, a cup of coffee, a small piece of apple pie. Margaret stared at her tray. This was more food than she'd seen in a single meal in over a year. The chicken, actual meat, a whole piece, not scraps or gristle. The bread was white and soft. There was butter. Real butter, not ersatz substitutes. The portions were generous, almost obscene to eyes accustomed to starvation rations. The women sat at tables, trays in front of them, and for a long moment nobody ate. They just looked at the food, unable to believe it was real, unable to believe they were allowed to eat it. Finally, Frida picked up her fork and cut a small piece of chicken. She put it in her mouth and closed her eyes. The taste exploded on her tongue. Salt, fat, flavor, real food. She chewed slowly, savoring it, and tears ran down her cheeks. Around the room, similar scenes played out. Women eating slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear. Women crying as they ate. Women staring at their trays in disbelief. One woman took a bite of the apple pie and sobbed. She'd forgotten that food could be sweet, that dessert existed, that life could include such simple pleasures. An American officer walked through the mess hall and announced in German, "If you want more food, you can come back through the line. There is enough for everyone to have seconds." Seconds. Enough food that you could have more than one serving. The concept was alien, but hunger won over disbelief. About half the women went back through the line. The servers smiled and filled their trays again without hesitation, without judgment, as if feeding enemy prisoners until they were full was the most natural thing in the world. After the meal, sitting at tables with full stomachs for the first time in months, the women were quiet. They were processing something that didn't fit their understanding of the world. The enemy was feeding them, generously, with care, with dignity. Why? Greta asked aloud what they were all thinking. Why are they doing this? Nobody had an answer, but the question would haunt them in the days and weeks to come. From the mess hall, they were shown to their barracks. The buildings were simple wooden structures, but they were weatherproof, heated, and clean. Inside, rows of beds, actual beds with mattresses, not straw pallets or bare wood, were set up with careful spacing. Each bed had 2 wool blankets, a pillow with a pillowcase, and sheets. Sheets. White cotton sheets that were clean and whole. Beside each bed was a small wooden crate that could serve as storage for personal items. The barracks had electric lights, electric heaters, and, most surprising of all, flush toilets and sinks with running water in an attached bathroom. No more latrines, no more freezing outdoor facilities, actual indoor plumbing. Margaret chose a bed near a window. She sat on the mattress, it compressed under her weight, actual cushioning, actual comfort. She touched the sheets, the blanket, the pillow. Everything was clean, dry, whole. She lay down, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Around her, other women were doing the same, claiming beds, touching the blankets, marveling at simple comforts that had once been ordinary but now felt miraculous. "This is nicer than my apartment in Berlin," Anna said quietly. "Before the war, I mean. This bed is better than what I slept on at home." It was true for many of them. The German economy had been in shambles for years. Even before the war, poverty had been widespread. During the war, everything had gone to the military effort. Civilians had made do with less and less until they'd had almost nothing. And these women, as low-ranking auxiliary personnel, had been at the bottom of the priority list. Now, as prisoners of the enemy, they had beds with mattresses, heated buildings, running water, clean clothes, and full stomachs. The irony was crushing. That night, as the lights were dimmed and the women settled into their beds, Frida spoke into the darkness. "I thought they would destroy us. I thought this would be punishment for losing the war. But this is not punishment. This is something else." "What is it then?" someone asked. "I don't know," Frida admitted. "But I know this. Everything we were told about Americans was a lie. Everything." In the darkness, many women were thinking the same thing. The propaganda had been specific and graphic about American cruelty, but reality was delivering something completely different. Organization, efficiency, abundance, and unexpected dignity. Sleep came slowly for most of them. They were too warm, too full, too clean, too comfortable. After months of sleeping cold and hungry on hard surfaces, actual comfort felt wrong, almost suspicious. But exhaustion eventually won. One by one, they fell into deep sleep. The kind that only comes when the body finally feels safe. And when they woke the next morning to breakfast being served, to another day of structure and relative comfort, The cognitive dissonance would only deepen. The morning bell at Camp Ruston rang at 6 a.m., not harsh and militaristic, but a simple chime that woke them gently. Margaret opened her eyes to winter sunlight streaming through the window and for a confused moment forgot where she was. Then memory rushed back. Louisiana. America. Prison camp. But a strange kind of prison that provided mattresses and breakfast. Morning routines were structured but not oppressive. The women had 45 minutes to wake up, use the facilities, make their beds, and dress before breakfast. American military personnel did bed checks, but they were looking for cleanliness and order, not searching for contraband or enforcing petty rules. Breakfast was served cafeteria style in the same mess hall as dinner. Coffee. Real coffee, as much as you wanted. Oatmeal with brown sugar and milk, scrambled eggs, toast with butter and jam, sometimes bacon or sausage, orange juice. The variety and abundance never stopped being shocking. After breakfast came work assignments. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be given work to do, but it also specified that the work couldn't be dangerous, military-related, or degrading. The Americans took this seriously. Work assignments were matched to skills and abilities. Margaret, with her administrative background, was assigned to help in the camp's record-keeping office. Greta, who'd been a telephone operator, worked in the communication center. Anna, who'd worked in supply logistics, helped manage the warehouse where camp supplies were stored. Frida, the oldest, was given lighter duty helping in the library. The work was real but not exhausting. They worked from 8 a.m. to noon, had an hour lunch break, then worked from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. That was it. 7 hours of work with breaks, 5 days a week. Weekends were free time, and they were paid for their work. Not much, 80 cents per day in camp script that could only be used at the camp canteen. But the fact that they were compensated for their labor was revolutionary. Prisoners being paid? It contradicted everything they understood about captivity. The camp canteen became a source of endless wonder, shelves stocked with items that had disappeared from Germany years ago. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, candy, soap, shampoo, toothpaste, writing paper, envelopes, pens, magazines, books. There were even cosmetics, lipstick, face powder, hand cream. The first time Margareta bought a Hershey's chocolate bar with her camp script, she held it in her hands for a full minute before opening it. Chocolate. She'd forgotten chocolate existed. She took a small bite, and the sweetness made her dizzy. She ate it slowly, savoring every piece, and then felt guilty for enjoying something so frivolous while Germany starved. Meals became routine in a way that never stopped being surreal. 3 times a day, regular as clockwork, hot food was served. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Sometimes American food that the women had to learn to eat. Hamburgers, hot dogs, macaroni and cheese. Sometimes attempts at German food, sausages, potato dishes, cabbage. The Americans tried to accommodate their preferences, which was itself strange. Why should the enemy care if they liked the food? Their bodies responded to the nutrition dramatically. Within 2 weeks, faces that had been gaunt began to fill out. Skin that had been sallow and sick-looking started to glow with health. Hair regained its shine. Energy returned. Women who had been shuffling with exhaustion began to walk normally again. The physical transformation was rapid and undeniable. This recovery was both wonderful and deeply troubling. They were getting healthy. The enemy was making them healthy. While Germany starved under occupation, they were thriving in an American prison camp. The guilt was constant and crushing. Letters from home began arriving about 3 weeks into their captivity. The American authorities, following Geneva Convention protocols, allowed prisoners to receive mail and send limited letters home. The mail took weeks to cross the Atlantic, but it eventually came. Margaret received a letter from her sister in Berlin. Her hands shook as she opened it, afraid of what she might read. The letter was written on poor quality paper, the handwriting shaky. Dear Greta, I am so relieved to know you are alive. Berlin is unrecognizable. Our apartment building was destroyed. We live now in the basement of a church with 12 other families. There is no heat. The water comes only a few hours each day. Food is rationed and the rations are barely enough to survive. Mother is sick, but there is no medicine. Father tries to find work, but there is nothing. The Americans control our sector, but they do not help much. We hear the Russians are worse in their sector. I pray for you every day. Your sister, Hilda. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in her pocket. That evening she couldn't eat dinner. The food stuck in her throat. The thought of her family starving in a church basement while she ate fried chicken in Louisiana made her physically ill. Around the mess hall, other women were having similar reactions to letters from home. Greta's letter brought news that her parents' house in Hamburg had been destroyed in the firebombing. They were living in a refugee camp, sleeping under tarps, eating soup once a day. Her younger brother had died of pneumonia because there was no medicine. Anna's letter was even worse. Her mother had died during the winter, probably from malnutrition and exposure. Her father was missing, possibly dead. Her 14-year-old sister was living with relatives in the countryside, working as unpaid labor on a farm in exchange for food and shelter. Frida's letter brought news that her son, she had an adult son who'd been a soldier, was in a Russian POW camp in Siberia. No details, just that he was alive. The uncertainty was agonizing. The contrast between their lives in Camp Rustin and the suffering in Germany became impossible to ignore. Every comfort, every convenience, every full meal highlighted the gulf. The Americans had rebuilt their prison camp with electricity, plumbing, heat, and abundant food. Germany was rubble and starvation. The women observed American abundance with growing understanding of just how complete Germany's defeat had been. It wasn't just military defeat, it was economic, technological, infrastructural, total. America could afford to feed enemy prisoners generously because it had so much. Germany couldn't even feed its own people. Working in the administrative office, Margaret saw paperwork that revealed the scale of American operations. Camp Rustin wasn't just for German women. It held thousands of German male POWs in separate compounds. All of them were fed, clothed, housed, and given medical care. The resources required were staggering. She saw supply orders, thousands of pounds of meat per week, tons of vegetables, mountains of bread, gallons of milk, medical supplies by the caseload, clothing by the thousands of units, all of this for prisoners. The wealth required to sustain such operations was beyond anything Germany had achieved even at the height of its power. The guards' casual behavior added to the surreal quality of captivity. American soldiers walked past the women without fear or aggression. Some nodded good morning. Some smiled. Some attempted basic German phrases, mangling the words but trying. One young soldier from Texas taught Greta how to say howdy and y'all. Cultural exchanges happened spontaneously. Americans were curious about Germany, not as an enemy nation, but as a place with culture and history. They asked about German food, about Christmas traditions, about beer gardens and music. The women found themselves teaching Americans basic German, explaining how to pronounce Guten Tag correctly, laughing at their attempts to say Eichhörnchen, squirrel. In return, the Americans taught them American games and customs, baseball, which seemed bizarre and complicated at first, but eventually became entertaining to watch. American slang that made no sense, cool, swell, 23 skidoo. American music on the radio, jazz and swing and crooners that sounded nothing like German marching songs. The prisoner population gaining weight became a visible symbol of the paradox. Women whose clothes had hung loose on skeletal frames now needed larger sizes. The camp provided new clothing without complaint, just handed them bigger dresses when they needed them. Cheeks that had been hollow filled out, eyes that had been dull with hunger and fatigue brightened. They looked healthier as prisoners of war than they had as free citizens of Nazi Germany. The irony was bitter. Guilt emerged like a chronic illness that wouldn't heal. It was there in the morning when they woke in warm beds. It was there at meals when they ate until full. It was there when they bought chocolate at the canteen. It was there when they laughed at something funny, then immediately felt shame for finding joy while Germany suffered. The guilt was sharpest when they realized they were afraid of repatriation, afraid of going back to the starvation and rubble, afraid of leaving the safety and comfort of captivity. What kind of prisoners dreaded freedom? Small interactions began to accumulate, each one chipping away at the wall of dehumanization that propaganda had built. Working in the administrative office, Margaret was assigned to help an American sergeant named Tom Williams with filing and record keeping. Tom was maybe 35 from somewhere called Indiana, had been in the Army for 3 years. He treated Margaret not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. Their communication started rough. His German was terrible, her English barely existed. But they developed a system using dictionaries, hand gestures, and patience. Tom taught her English words. She taught him German. They laughed at each other's mistakes. One day, Margaret was struggling to understand a complex filing system. Tom saw her frustration and sat down beside her. "Look," he said slowly in English, pointing to the files. "Last name, first, then date, then unit number, see?" He treated her like she was capable of learning, like her understanding mattered, like she was a person whose work had value. It was such a small thing, patience with a confused colleague. But after years of being treated as expendable, it meant everything. Language learning created unexpected connections. Greta, working in communications, started learning English more seriously with help from an American corporal named James Henderson. James was patient and funny, using jokes to teach her idioms and slang. "Why do you help me?" she asked one day in halting English. James thought for a moment. "My grandma was German, came to America in 1890. She used to say that people are people everywhere, and kindness costs nothing. I guess I believe that." Shared cigarettes became a ritual of peace. American soldiers would offer cigarettes to the women during breaks. At first, many refused, suspicious of kindness, afraid of owing something. But gradually they accepted. Smoking together, unable to communicate much verbally, but sharing tobacco, became a strange form of communion. One soldier, a farm boy from Iowa named Danny, would sit near the work area during his breaks and play harmonica, American folk songs, melancholy and sweet. The music was so different from German military marches or classical pieces, simpler, more personal, almost intimate. Eventually, some of the women hummed along, even though they didn't know the words. Guard interactions revealed humanity on both sides. An American guard noticed Anna shivering during a cool morning. Without comment, he brought her a jacket. Another guard saw Frida struggling to carry a heavy box and helped her lift it. A third noticed Margaret looking tired and brought her a chair. These weren't grand gestures, they were simple acts of noticing another person's discomfort and alleviating it. But they were revolutionary because they came from people who were supposed to be enemies. Cultural exchanges deepened understanding. A group of American soldiers asked the women to teach them a German Christmas carol. It was approaching Christmas 1945. The women taught them Stille Nacht, Silent Night, which the Americans recognized as Silent Night in English. They sang it together, German and English verses mixing, and several women cried at the beauty and strangeness of sharing this sacred song with the enemy. In return, the Americans taught them American Christmas traditions, decorating trees, hanging stockings, baking cookies. The camp administration even organized a Christmas celebration with a decorated tree, gifts, small items from the canteen, and a special meal with turkey and all the fixings. Unexpected kindnesses accumulated. An American nurse noticed that Anna's hands were cracked and bleeding from work. Without being asked, she gave Anna a jar of hand cream. A guard saw Greta trying to write a letter with a broken pencil and gave her a new one. Another American helped Margaret understand a complicated English document, taking the time to explain each paragraph. One profound moment came when Frida fell ill with a bad cold. Instead of ignoring it or treating it as an inconvenience, the camp medical staff put her in the infirmary, gave her antibiotics, and excused her from work until she recovered. A doctor checked on her daily. Nurses brought her soup and tea. "Why?" she asked the nurse. "I am the enemy. Why care if I am sick?" The nurse, a woman named Captain Mary Stevens, looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because you're a person," she said simply. "And people deserve medical care when they're sick. Enemy or not, you're still human." That answer, the simplicity of it, the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of shared humanity, stayed with Frida. It contradicted everything she'd been taught about American barbarism. The contradiction gnawed at all of them. Every kindness, every moment of basic human decency was another piece of propaganda crumbling away. If Americans were the monsters of Nazi propaganda, where was the cruelty? If they were the barbaric enemy, where was the degradation? It was not cruelty but kindness that unsettled them most deeply. Cruelty they'd prepared for. Cruelty they could have understood, could have used to fuel their hatred, could have used to maintain their identity as victims. But kindness? Kindness demanded they see their captors as human. And seeing the enemy as human meant questioning everything. Memory collided with reality daily. They remembered the propaganda films they'd been shown, depicting Americans as cruel savages. They remembered the speeches about American degeneracy and German racial superiority. They remembered being told that capture meant torture and death. And then they looked at their clean clothes, their full stomachs, their healing bodies, and nothing made sense anymore. The irony was unbearable. They had lost the war, lost their freedom, become prisoners of the enemy. But in captivity, they'd found something they hadn't expected. Evidence that the propaganda had been lies, that people on both sides were fundamentally the same, that nationality mattered less than they'd been taught. Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty. That truth became clearer every day, because cruelty confirmed hatred and made you feel justified. But kindness from those you'd been taught to hate, that forced you to question everything. It demanded recognition of shared humanity, and shared humanity made war incomprehensible. 3 months into captivity, Margaret sat at a desk in the administrative office during her lunch break, writing in a small notebook she'd bought at the canteen. Not a letter home, those were limited and censored, but private thoughts she couldn't speak aloud. "I am healthier now than I have been in 4 years, she wrote in careful script. "I have gained 12 pounds. I sleep through the night without fear. I work with real supplies that aren't running out. And yet my heart is sick with confusion. How is it right that I am better off as a prisoner in America than I was as a free citizen in Germany? What does this say about everything we were told?" Propaganda versus experience created a war in her mind. Everything she'd been taught since childhood said that Germans were superior, that National Socialism was the path to greatness, that Americans were weak and decadent, but daily reality contradicted every piece of that narrative. The Americans weren't weak, they had overwhelming power in technology, economy, and organization. They weren't decadent, they worked efficiently and effectively. They weren't cruel, they followed rules that protected even their enemies. Every observation chipped away at the propaganda's foundation. Which truth was real? The one she'd been taught her entire adult life, or the one she was living every day? Loyalty versus survival tore at her constantly. She'd served the Wehrmacht faithfully for years. She'd believed in Germany, in the cause, in the mission. She'd worked long hours in terrible conditions because she thought it mattered. But Germany had failed her. The Reich had sent her to work with inadequate supplies, no support, and ultimately abandoned her to capture. Meanwhile, the enemy, the supposedly inferior Americans, was keeping her alive, healthy, and even treating her with dignity. Where did loyalty lie? With a nation that had left her to starve, or with her own survival and well-being? Shame versus relief created impossible emotional tangles. She was ashamed to be comfortable while Germany suffered. Ashamed that she'd gained weight while her sister ate once a day. Ashamed that she slept in a heated building while families huddled in ruins. The guilt was a constant weight, but she was also relieved. Relieved to be alive. Relieved to be warm and fed. Relieved not to live in constant fear and deprivation. Relieved to be treated like a human being. And the relief made her feel like a traitor. Could both be true? Could she mourn Germany's suffering while being grateful for her own safety? The contradiction felt like it might tear her apart. Her past beliefs were crumbling like a bombed building. Everything she'd been taught about German superiority was demonstrably false. The Americans had better everything. Everything she'd been taught about American weakness was a lie. They'd won the war decisively. Everything she'd been taught about racial hierarchies was nonsense. The Americans treated German prisoners with more dignity than Germans had treated each other. Every meal chipped away at propaganda. Every act of medical care, every kind word, every moment of basic human decency from the enemy was another brick removed from the wall of indoctrination. She could feel the whole structure collapsing. The identity crisis consumed her. If she wasn't a loyal German serving the fatherland, who was she? If Germany wasn't superior, what had she been working for? If the Americans weren't evil, what did that make the war? And most terrifying of all, if everything she'd believed was a lie, what truths could she trust? She looked at her hands, clean now and healing from the antiseptic cream an American nurse had given her. These hands had typed reports for the Luftwaffe, had processed information that helped the war effort, had served a cause she'd believed in. Now they filed paperwork for the American military, helped organize records, served the enemy. Who was she becoming? She didn't recognize herself anymore. The internal conflict wasn't Margaretta's alone. Every woman in the camp was wrestling with similar demons. In the barracks at night, whispered conversations revealed the depth of their collective crisis. "We were told Americans would starve us and work us to death," one woman said in the darkness. "But they feed us better than our own government ever did. How do we make sense of this?" "Perhaps what we were told wasn't entirely true," another suggested carefully. "Not entirely true?" Frida's voice cut through the dark, sharp with anger. "It was all lies, every word. They lied about the Americans. They lied about the war. They lied about German superiority. They lied about everything, and we believed them because we had no choice." Silence followed her words. Because admitting the lying meant confronting what that meant. That they'd sacrificed for nothing. That the war had been based on falsehoods. That their suffering had been unnecessary and avoidable. Different responses emerged among the women. Some resisted the truth, clinging to old beliefs because they had nothing else to hold on to. "This is propaganda," they insisted. "The Americans treat us well now, but wait. The real punishment will come later. They're softening us up." But months passed and the punishment never came. Only more routine, more organization, more evidence that the Americans operated by different principles than they'd been taught. Others accepted the truth too quickly, embracing everything American, trying to forget they'd ever been German. They practiced English obsessively, imitated American mannerisms, rejected anything that reminded them of their past. They were the ones who wanted to stay in America after the war, who applied for immigration, who tried to erase their German identity. Most fell somewhere in between, confused, conflicted, trying to reconcile irreconcilable truths. Generational differences deepened divisions. Older women like Frida, who remembered Germany before Hitler, found it easier to see the propaganda for what it was. They'd watched their country transform from a struggling democracy into a totalitarian nightmare. They'd seen freedoms disappear, watched neighbors turn on each other, witnessed lies become official truth. Younger women like Anna, who'd grown up entirely under Nazi rule, struggled more. The propaganda was all they'd ever known. National Socialism had been taught in their schools, praised in their communities, enforced by the state. Questioning it meant questioning their entire understanding of the world. "I was taught from childhood that Germans were racially superior," Anna said one night, voice small and lost. "That we were destined to rule. That other peoples were inferior. But Sergeant Williams, who supervises my work, is black. And he's one of the kindest, most professional people I've ever met. He treats me with more respect than my own German supervisors did." So either he's not inferior, or everything I was taught about race is a lie. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Because if the racial ideology was false, what else was false? And if it was all lies, what had they been fighting for? Work experience had mattered in the German system. Officers were treated better than enlisted, technical staff better than manual laborers, Germans better than everyone else. But here the Americans seemed to believe in something else, that all people had inherent worth regardless of position or nationality. It was radical and confusing. Secret confessions passed in the darkest hours of night. Women admitting to each other what they couldn't say in daylight. "I don't want to go back to Germany," one woman whispered. "Is that terrible? Am I a traitor for wanting to stay here?" "I had doubts even before the surrender," another admitted, "when officers had plenty while we starved, when they told us victory was certain while we could see we were losing. I wondered if it was all lies, but I was afraid to say it out loud." "I'm forgetting German," Greta confessed, sounding terrified. "Sometimes English words come to me first. I'm losing my language. I'm losing myself." "Maybe the self you're losing needed to be lost," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe we all need to become different people. Better people. People who don't believe lies just because authority says so." The growing realization spread like dawn, slow, inevitable, illuminating everything in new light. They'd been deceived, not just about Americans, but about everything. The Nazis had lied about Germany's strength, about the war's progress, about the treatment they'd received from the enemy, about the very nature of what made people valuable. If the lies were this big, this pervasive, what else was false? What other beliefs needed to be questioned? But the deepest recognition, the one that cut to the bone, was about power and how it operated. America's display of power through mercy was more devastating than any violence could have been. By treating prisoners well, by following the Geneva Convention, by providing food and medicine and dignity, the Americans demonstrated something profound. They were strong enough to afford mercy. They didn't need cruelty because they'd won so completely that brutality would be pointless. Nazi Germany had relied on cruelty because it was weak. It needed fear to maintain control, needed brutality to compensate for its failures, needed dehumanization to justify its atrocities. The Americans could afford to be kind because they had true strength, economic, military, moral. This truth was more demoralizing than defeat in battle. It revealed that the war had been unwinnable from the start, that German ideology had been built on lies and weaknesses, that everything they'd sacrificed for had been doomed. The individual worth concept crept in through 1,000 small moments. The way the Americans used their names instead of numbers, the way guards asked about their health, their families, their needs, the way they were paid for labor, the way their mail was treated with respect, the way their complaints were actually heard and sometimes addressed. In Nazi Germany, they'd been expendable components of the war machine. Their value was determined entirely by their usefulness to the state. Here, even as prisoners, they were individuals with inherent worth. The contrast was stark and troubling. Democracy ideas entered through unexpected channels. Working alongside Americans, the women observed how decisions were made. Sergeants questioned officers' orders if something seemed wrong. Enlisted personnel complained about policies openly without being punished. Different opinions were voiced and sometimes incorporated. This openness was shocking. In the German military, questioning authority meant punishment, possibly death. Disagreement was treason. Obedience was absolute. But here, questioning seemed normal, expected even. The idea that ordinary people could participate in decisions, could voice disagreements, could be heard, it was revolutionary. Greta observed this in the communication center. When a new procedure was implemented that created problems, the American staff discussed it openly, pointed out the issues, suggested improvements. The officer in charge actually listened and modified the procedure based on their feedback. "That would never happen in Germany," she told Margaret later. "You follow orders. You don't question. You don't suggest, even if the orders create problems or get people killed. But here, they want input. They value different perspectives. They think ordinary people might have good ideas." Education happened informally but powerfully. Americans shared newspapers, magazines, books. The women saw photographs of American cities, intact, modern, prosperous. They read about democracy, about elections where citizens chose their leaders. They learned about rights and freedoms that seemed almost fantastical. Freedom of speech, of press, of religion, of assembly. One American soldier, a college student before the war, gave Margaret a pamphlet about the American Constitution. She read it slowly, struggling with the English, asking for help with words she didn't know. The ideas in it, that governments derive power from the consent of the governed, that all people have unalienable rights, that power should be divided and checked, were stunning. "Do Americans really believe this?" she asked. "We try to," he said. "Don't always succeed. We have problems too. Racial segregation, inequality, poverty. But these are our ideals. These are what we're supposed to stand for. And when we fail to live up to them, people are allowed to say so and push for change. Allowed to criticize the government, allowed to demand change. The concept was almost incomprehensible to someone raised under totalitarianism. The most dangerous weapon the Americans had wasn't the atomic bomb or superior numbers. It was dignity. By treating prisoners with basic human respect, they'd achieved what torture never could. They'd made their captives question everything, had opened minds that brutality would have closed, had won hearts that cruelty would have hardened. Margaret wrote in her notebook, "If the enemy values our lives and dignity more than our own leaders did, what does that say about who the real enemy was?" The question was rhetorical, but the answer was becoming clear. The real enemy hadn't been the Americans. It had been the lies they'd been told about Americans. It had been the system that valued the state over human life. It had been the propaganda that had blinded them to reality. "Perhaps captivity is revealing more truth than freedom ever did," Frida said one evening. "Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty," Anna added quietly, "because you cannot maintain hatred for those who show you mercy. And without hatred, the war makes no sense. Why did we fight? What did all those deaths accomplish? If we'd known the truth from the beginning, would any of it have happened?" These weren't just observations. They were confessions, admissions that everything they'd believed was wrong, that the war had been built on lies, that they'd been used and manipulated and discarded. The transformation wasn't complete. Doubt still lingered, old beliefs still surfaced, guilt still weighed heavy. But something fundamental had shifted. The women were no longer the same people who'd arrived at Camp Rustin expecting brutality. They'd been changed, not by violence but by its absence, not by cruelty but by unexpected kindness, not by propaganda but by lived experience. And there was no going back from that change, even if they returned to Germany, even if they tried to forget, the truth had been planted in their minds. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unlearn what you've learned. You can't unknow what you've come to know. The turning point came on a warm March day in 1946, 4 months into their captivity. The camp administration organized a special event, a lecture about women's health to be given by an American doctor. Attendance was optional, but most of the women went, curious about what this would entail. Dr. Elizabeth Warner was a woman in her 40s, professional and warm. Through a translator, she talked about nutrition, hygiene, and reproductive health, topics that had been taboo in German culture, especially in the militaristic environment they'd come from, were discussed openly and matter-of-factly. Then she got to the topic that would change everything: menstruation and women's health products. "I know that when you first arrived, many of you were confused by the sanitary napkins we provided," Dr. Warner said. "This confusion revealed something important, that in Germany, even basic products for women's health and dignity were treated as luxuries or ignored entirely." She held up a sanitary napkin, the same kind they'd been receiving every month. "This is not a luxury. This is a basic necessity for women's health and dignity. In America, we believe that women deserve clean, safe products for their monthly cycles, not because it's a special treat, but because it's a basic human right." She went on to explain the health risks of using newspaper, dirty rags, or nothing at all, infections, toxic shock, reproductive health problems. She talked about how proper menstrual hygiene was essential for women to participate fully in work and life, to maintain dignity, to stay healthy. "The fact that you didn't have access to these products in Germany wasn't because they didn't exist," she continued. "It's because your government prioritized war over women's basic health needs. They could have manufactured these products. They chose not to. They could have educated women about reproductive health. They chose not to. They could have treated women's bodies with dignity. They chose not to." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd never thought about it this way. She'd assumed that the lack of menstrual products was just a consequence of war, of scarcity, of hard times. But Dr. Warner was saying something different, that it was a choice, that even in hard times societies choose what to prioritize, and Nazi Germany had chosen not to prioritize women's basic dignity. She thought about the years she'd spent using newspaper and rags, feeling ashamed and dirty during her periods, unable to work effectively, suffering infections. She'd thought that was just how things were, but it wasn't. It was how things were in a society that didn't value women as fully human. Dr. Warner continued, "Every month when you receive these products from us, I want you to remember this. You deserve dignity. You deserve health. You deserve to be treated as whole human beings with bodies that have needs. This isn't charity. This isn't a special favor. This is basic respect." After the lecture, Margaret walked outside in a daze. Everything Dr. Warner had said was clicking into place with observations she'd been making for months but hadn't fully articulated. The sanitary napkins weren't just about menstruation. They were about whether women's bodies and needs mattered, and in Nazi Germany, they hadn't. Women had been valued only for their ability to produce children or work for the war effort. Their comfort, health, and dignity hadn't mattered unless they served the state's purposes. But here in America, even enemy prisoners received sanitary products, because the underlying philosophy was different, that human beings had inherent worth and deserved basic dignity regardless of their utility to the state. She sat down on a bench outside the barracks and started to cry. Great, gasping sobs that she'd been holding back for months. Because she understood now, really understood what had been done to her and every woman in Germany. They'd been taught to see their suffering as noble sacrifice, to view deprivation as strength, to accept degradation as duty. And it had all been lies designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum care. Anna found her there, crying on the bench. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "Everything," Margaret choked out. "Everything was wrong. They lied to us about everything. And I believed them. I believed that suffering was necessary, that sacrifice was noble, that German women were strong because we could endure anything. But we weren't strong. We were abused. We were exploited. We were treated as less than human by our own government." Anna sat beside her, tears starting to stream down her own face. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing. Every time I use a sanitary napkin, I think about how I used to use newspaper and how ashamed I felt. And I wonder why I ever accepted that. Why did we think that was normal?" "Because we were told it was necessary," Margaret said. "Because we were told that real German women were strong and didn't need luxuries. Because we were told that sacrifice was our duty. But it was all lies to make us accept mistreatment. Around the camp, other women were having similar realizations. The lecture had been a catalyst, bringing months of observations and experiences into sharp focus. Greta confronted the truth in her own way. She'd been comparing the way American military personnel treated each other with how German military had functioned. In the American system, even the lowest-ranking person had rights. They could report mistreatment. They could refuse illegal orders. They had access to medical care, adequate food, time off. Regulations existed to protect them, and those regulations were generally followed. In the German system, especially toward the end of the war, there had been no protections. You did what you were told, or faced punishment. Your needs didn't matter. Your health didn't matter. You were a tool to be used up and discarded. The difference wasn't just about resources. It was about philosophy. One system saw people as having inherent worth. The other saw them as expendable components. Frida's realization came through a different route. An American guard, seeing her struggling to read an English newspaper, offered to help teach her English more formally. They met a few times a week, and he patiently worked through vocabulary and grammar with her. "Why do you do this?" she asked him one day. "I am the enemy. I am a prisoner. Why waste time teaching me?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. "Because you want to learn, and I can help. Why wouldn't I?" The simplicity of his answer, the assumption that helping another person was its own justification, revealed a worldview so different from what she'd known. In Nazi Germany, everything had been transactional. You helped people if they could help you back, if it benefited the state, if it served a purpose. The idea of helping just because someone needed help, with no expectation of return, was alien. That night back in the barracks, the women had the most honest conversation they'd had since arriving. "We need to say it out loud," Margaret announced. "All of us have been thinking it, but we need to say it. Nazi Germany was wrong. Not just about the war. About everything. About how to treat people. About what gives life value. About what a society should be." "Yes," Anna said immediately. "Yes," Greta agreed. "Yes," Frida nodded. "And it's not just that they lost the war. It's that they deserved to lose. Because what they were building was monstrous." Others joined in, one by one, voicing what they'd been afraid to admit even to themselves. "They lied about everything. They used us. They didn't care if we lived or died. The Americans are treating us better than our own government ever did. Everything we suffered was unnecessary and preventable. The war was based on lies from the beginning. The acceptance was painful because it meant confronting how completely they'd been deceived. It meant admitting that years of their lives had been wasted serving evil. It meant recognizing that the suffering had been for nothing. But the pain of truth was also the pain of liberation. Breaking free from lies hurt. Seeing clearly after years of propaganda-induced blindness was disorienting. But it was also necessary. It was freedom of the most profound kind, freedom of the mind. Margaret held up the box of sanitary napkins she'd received that week. "This," she said, "became my turning point. Such a small thing. Just menstrual products. But what it represents is huge. It represents a society that believes women deserve dignity even in the most basic bodily functions. That believes prisoners deserve health. Care. That believes human beings have worth beyond their utility." "Nazi Germany could never have given us these," Anna added. "Not because they couldn't manufacture them, but because the whole philosophy was wrong. We weren't seen as fully human. We were tools. And the Americans, the enemy we were taught to hate, the degenerate democracy we were supposed to despise, they're the ones treating us like human beings," Greta finished. The irony was complete. The nation they'd fought against was demonstrating values that their own nation had claimed to embody but never actually practiced. This wasn't just about sanitary napkins anymore. It was about everything. Food, medical care, education, work conditions, legal protections, respect, dignity. On every single measure, they were better off as prisoners of the American enemy than they'd been as citizens of Nazi Germany. The recognition of humanity in the enemy was now complete and undeniable. These weren't monsters. They were people operating under a different system, one that had fundamental respect for human dignity built into its structure. America wasn't perfect. The women had learned about segregation, about inequality, about problems in American society. But the basic foundation was different. The starting assumption was that people had rights, and the system tried, however imperfectly, to protect those rights. The symbolic meaning of that first day, receiving sanitary products they didn't understand, now made perfect sense. It represented the collision between two worldviews, one that saw women's basic needs as luxuries that could be ignored, one that saw them as rights that should be provided. One woman had asked on that first day, why would they waste resources on something disposable? Now they knew the answer. Because they could. Because they had abundance. Because they valued human dignity enough to allocate resources to it. Because the whole foundation of their society was different. As the women sat in the barracks that night, processing their collective revelation, Margaret thought about the journey from confusion to understanding. How the sanitary napkins had been the first crack in the propaganda's wall. How every day after had widened that crack. How the whole structure of lies had finally collapsed. We can never go back to believing the old lies, she said quietly. Even when we go home to Germany, even if people there still believe the propaganda, we'll know the truth. We've seen it. We've lived it. Will Germany want to hear the truth? Anna asked. Or will they hate us for it? Nobody had an answer. But they knew that carrying this truth back to Germany would be the hardest thing they'd ever done. Harder than the war. Harder than captivity. Harder than facing starvation and destruction. Because truth was dangerous. Truth demanded change. And not everyone wanted to change. In June 1946, all German women POWs at Camp Rustin would be repatriated to Germany within 3 months. They were going home. The American officials expected celebration. They got anxiety instead. I don't want to go back, Anna said quietly to Margaret. Does that make me a traitor? She wasn't alone. Many women dreaded the return. Here they had stability, food, safety, routine. What awaited them in Germany? Rubble, starvation, and a society that might not want to hear what they'd learned. Practical fears were intense. Germany was destroyed. Cities were ruins. Food was scarce even with Allied aid. Housing was a disaster, millions of people homeless or living in damaged buildings. Jobs were non-existent. The economy had collapsed. Disease was rampant. The infrastructure was broken. Going from Camp Rustin with its electric lights, running water, regular meals, and heated buildings, to occupied Germany would be like traveling backward in time. They'd be trading comfort for deprivation, safety for uncertainty. But the deeper fear was about truth and reconciliation. How could they explain that they'd been treated well by the enemy? That they'd gained weight while Germans starved? That they'd learned to see Americans as human? Greta worried aloud. My parents will see that I'm healthy. They'll know I was fed. How do I tell them I ate American food while they survived on rations? They'll hate me. Frida had different concerns. I learned things here. About democracy, about human rights, about how societies can be organized differently. If I talk about these things in Germany, will I be seen as a traitor, as corrupted by the enemy? Margaret feared the weight of truth itself. We know now that Nazi Germany was evil. Not just wrong about the war, but fundamentally evil in how it treated people. We know the Americans are more human than we were taught. We know democracy can work. But Germany isn't ready to hear this. They're suffering, angry, looking for someone to blame. Will they want to hear that their suffering was caused by their own government's choices? The burden of knowledge was heavy. They'd been given a gift in captivity, the gift of seeing through propaganda, of understanding different systems, of recognizing shared humanity. But that gift came with responsibility. What would they do with this knowledge? Some women decided to stay in America if possible. They applied for immigration, sought sponsors, tried to build new lives. They wanted to forget Germany entirely, to start over in a country that had treated them better than their homeland. Others felt duty-bound to return. My family is there, Anna said. They need me. Even if Germany is terrible, even if they don't want to hear the truth, I can't abandon them. Margaret fell somewhere in between. I want to go back, but I'm afraid of who I've become. I'm not the same person who left Germany. I've changed. I've grown. I've learned to think critically. Will there be room for this new version of me? The final months at Camp Rustin took on a bittersweet quality. The women were grateful for their time there. It had saved their lives, taught them truths, given them tools to understand the world differently. but they were also preparing to leave behind safety for uncertainty. September 1946. The women boarded a ship in New Orleans bound for Germany. The American military personnel who'd worked with them came to see them off. There were genuine farewells, some tears, exchanges of addresses. Tom Williams, the sergeant Margaret had worked with, gave her a small English-German dictionary. "Keep learning," he said. "Keep asking questions. Keep thinking for yourself." Lieutenant Johnson, who'd first explained sanitary napkins to them, gave each woman a 6-month supply to take home. "For you and for your friends and family. Show them that these exist. Show them that women deserve dignity." The ship crossed the Atlantic carrying women who'd left as defeated prisoners and were returning as something else, witnesses. Witnesses to an alternative way of organizing society, treating people, valuing human life. When they arrived in Bremen, the devastation was worse than they'd imagined. The port city was rubble. Burned-out buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. People moved like ghosts through the wreckage, thin, ragged, desperate. The occupation forces, British in this sector, maintained order, but barely. The women were processed through a repatriation center. Paperwork, medical checks, documentation. Then they were released to find their own ways home. No transportation provided, no support, just good luck and freedom. Margaret made her way to Berlin on a series of trains and trucks, a journey that took 3 days and would have taken 6 hours before the war. When she finally reached her home district, she didn't recognize it. Entire neighborhoods were gone. The apartment building where she'd lived was a shell, windows blown out, roof collapsed. She found her family in a basement converted into living space, her sister Hilda, her mother, her young nephew. The reunion was joyful but painful. They looked starved. Her mother had aged 20 years in the 6 years of war. Her nephew, born during the war, was small and underdeveloped from malnutrition. Hilda stared at Margaret's healthy body, her full face, her good skin. "You look good," she said, the words heavy with unspoken questions. "They fed me," Margaret said simply. "The Americans fed me well." Her mother's face twisted with complex emotions. "Our enemy fed you while we starved. How does that make sense?" "It doesn't," Margaret admitted, "unless everything we were told about the enemy was a lie." The conversation was difficult, painful, full of truths nobody wanted to hear. But Margaret persisted. She showed them the sanitary napkins she'd brought, explained what they were, talked about how the Americans believed women deserved dignity. Her sister cried, from recognition of what they'd been denied, from grief at the unnecessary suffering. Similar scenes played out across Germany as the women returned to their families. The reunions were joyful but complicated. The contrast between the prisoners' health and their families' suffering created tension. Questions arose about loyalty, about who had suffered more, about whether being a POW in America had been too easy. Anna returned to find her father alive after all. He'd been in a Soviet POW camp and had just been released. But he was a broken man, traumatized by brutal treatment. When she tried to tell him that her American captivity had been humane, even kind, he couldn't process it. His experience had been the opposite: violence, starvation, death. The contradiction was too much. Frida found her son had died in the Soviet camp. Malnutrition and disease. She stood in her destroyed home in Yokohama and realized she had nothing left. No husband, no son, no house, no city. She was 53 years old and had to start completely over. The guilt of having been fed while others suffered was crushing. Every woman who returned from American captivity felt it. They'd survived, even thrived in some ways, while millions died. The survivors' guilt mixed with knowledge guilt. They knew truths that implicated not just the Nazi leadership, but the entire society in collective delusion. Years passed. Decades passed. The women who'd been prisoners at Camp Rustin carried their experiences in different ways. Margaret became a teacher in the new West German education system. She taught her students about critical thinking, about questioning authority, about recognizing propaganda. She kept that English-German dictionary on her desk for 40 years. When asked about her war experience, she would pull out the old box of sanitary napkins she'd preserved and tell the story of learning that dignity was a right, not a luxury. In 1962, when her daughter was old enough to understand, Margaret sat her down for a serious conversation. She pulled out the box of sanitary napkins, the wrapper faded but still recognizable. "This," she told her daughter, "taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. When I first received these, I didn't know what they were. We'd never had such things in Germany. And in that moment of confusion, I began to understand how completely our government had failed us, not just in the war, but in basic dignity." Her daughter touched the wrapper carefully. "But they're just products for periods." "Exactly," Margaret said. "Just basic necessity items. But we didn't have them. And the Americans, our enemy, the people we'd been taught to hate, gave them to us. Not because they had to. Because they believed we deserved dignity. That lesson, that enemies can show mercy, that humanity transcends nationality, that propaganda lies, That lesson saved my soul. She explained how the sanitary napkins had been the beginning of understanding, the first crack in the propaganda's wall. How every day after had widened that crack until the whole structure of lies collapsed. How she'd learned that systems matter, that how a society treats the vulnerable reveals its true values. That democracy and human rights weren't just nice ideas, but fundamentally different ways of organizing human life. Never believe propaganda, she told her daughter. Always ask questions. Always look for what people do, not just what they say. The Nazis said they valued German women, but they gave us newspaper for our periods. The Americans said nothing about valuing us, but gave us clean, sanitary products. Actions reveal truth. Remember that. Anna took a different path. She never spoke about her captivity to anyone outside her immediate family. The memories were too complicated, too contradictory. She buried them deep and tried to move forward. But sometimes late at night, she'd remember the taste of American coffee, the feel of clean sheets, the kindness of Sergeant Williams teaching her English, and she'd wonder what her life might have been if she'd stayed, if she'd been brave enough to start over in America. Greta became active in the German-American friendship societies that formed in the 1950s. She believed in reconciliation, in building bridges, in teaching the next generation that former enemies could become friends. She organized exchange programs, hosted American visitors, taught English to German students. Her way of processing the experience was to make something positive from it, to help ensure that the understanding she'd gained wasn't wasted. Frida, having lost everything, started over with fierce determination. She became a social worker, helping other displaced people, refugees, and those struggling in post-war Germany. She used what she'd learned about human dignity and rights to advocate for better treatment of the vulnerable. When asked why she cared so much about refugee rights, she'd say simply, "I was a refugee once. I know what it's like to be at the mercy of others' kindness or cruelty." What they told their children when they told them anything varied. But common themes emerged. Question authority. Don't believe propaganda just because everyone else does. Judge systems by how they treat the powerless, the prisoners, the vulnerable. Enemies can be human. Nationality doesn't determine worth. Women deserve dignity in all aspects of life, including the most basic bodily functions. Democracy and human rights aren't luxuries, they're necessities for a humane society. How it changed them was profound and permanent. They could never again accept simple narratives about good and evil, us versus them. They'd seen the complexity, how ordinary people on both sides were trapped by larger forces, how propaganda distorted reality, how systems determined whether people acted with cruelty or compassion. They'd learned that America wasn't perfect. Through newspapers and books, they learned about segregation, about the Japanese internment camps, about inequality and injustice in American society. But they'd also learned that America had something Nazi Germany never had: mechanisms for challenging injustice, rights that protected dissent, a fundamental belief that government served people rather than people serving government. The universal truth they extracted was both simple and profound. Societies reveal their true values, not in their propaganda, but in their treatment of those they have power over. Nazi Germany had claimed to value German women, but treated them as expendable tools. America had made no special claims about German POWs, but treated them with basic dignity. The difference wasn't in the rhetoric, but in the reality. They learned that propaganda works by controlling information, by preventing people from seeing alternatives, by making abuse seem normal through constant repetition. But experience could break propaganda's power. Once you'd experienced an alternative, once you'd seen that societies could be organized differently, that women's needs could be taken seriously, that prisoners could be treated humanely, you couldn't unknow it. They learned that small things revealed big truths. Sanitary napkins weren't just about menstruation. They were about whether women's bodies and needs mattered. Regular meals weren't just about nutrition, they were about whether prisoners were seen as human. Medical care wasn't just about health, it was about whether people had inherent worth. The women understood that they'd been given a rare and precious gift, the ability to compare systems directly, to experience both propaganda and reality, to see through lies to truth. That gift came with responsibility, to remember, to teach, to ensure that future generations understood the dangers of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. And so the sanitary napkin, that simple, disposable product that confused and surprised them on their first day, became more than just a hygiene item. It became a symbol of dignity, a symbol of a society that valued women's basic needs, a symbol of the vast gulf between Nazi propaganda and American reality. For those 312 German women who arrived at Camp Rustin in December 1945, the experience of receiving something they'd never seen before, something so basic that American teenage girls took it for granted, would become the beginning of profound transformation. That small white package, wrapped in clean and disposable, represented everything they'd been denied: dignity, care, resources allocated to women's needs, a society that saw them as fully human. They had expected brutality and found competence. They had expected starvation and found abundance. They had expected degradation and found dignity. Every expectation was overturned. Every piece of propaganda was revealed as a lie. The paradox that tormented them, that the enemy treated them better than their own government had, revealed a truth about power, values, and humanity. Nazi Germany had claimed moral superiority but demonstrated moral bankruptcy through its treatment of people. America had made no special moral claims but demonstrated its values through actions, feeding prisoners, providing medical care, respecting human dignity even in captivity. As Margaret told her daughter decades later, holding that faded wrapper like a sacred relic, they could have treated us any way they wanted. We were defeated enemies, prisoners, powerless. They could have starved us, humiliated us, worked us to death. But they chose differently. They chose to follow rules that protected even their enemies. They chose to see us as human beings deserving of basic dignity, and that choice changed everything. She held up the old sanitary napkin package. This taught me that small things reveal big truths, that how a society treats women's basic needs shows its real values, that abundance isn't just about wealth, it's about what you choose to do with that wealth, that dignity isn't a luxury to be granted to the worthy, it's a right belonging to all humans. The universal truth that emerged from Camp Rustin echoes through history. Propaganda only works when people can't compare it to reality. Nazi Germany had told women that suffering was noble, that sacrifice was duty, that deprivation was strength. But once the women experienced an alternative, a society that believed women deserved sanitary products, regular meals, medical care, and basic respect, the propaganda's power shattered. They learned that the real battle wasn't between nations but between truth and lies, between systems that valued human dignity and systems that exploited it, between propaganda that demanded belief and experience that revealed reality. The women who returned to Germany in 1946 carried dangerous knowledge. They'd seen that enemies could be human, that democracy could work, that women's needs mattered, that abundance could be used for good, that dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. In a Germany still processing its defeat, still clinging to old narratives, still resistant to confronting hard truths, this knowledge was revolutionary. Some kept silent, the truth too painful or too dangerous to speak. Others spoke up, teaching their children and grandchildren the lessons they'd learned. All of them carried the knowledge permanently, a lens through which they saw the world differently. The sanitary napkins were just the beginning, the first moment when reality contradicted propaganda so clearly that questions became unavoidable. But they represented something larger. The idea that women's bodies and needs deserved consideration, that basic dignity should be provided not because someone had earned it, but because they were human, that societies could be judged by how they treated the powerless. In the end, the story of those German women at Camp Rustin isn't just about World War II or POW camps or sanitary products. It's about how propaganda works and how it breaks. It's about the power of small kindnesses to shatter big lies. It's about the courage required to admit you were wrong, that everything you believed was false, that the enemy was more human than your own leaders. It's about the transformative power of dignity, how treating people well, even enemies, even prisoners, can change hearts and minds more effectively than any weapon. The Americans who provided sanitary napkins to confuse German women probably didn't think they were making a political statement. They were just following regulations, providing basic supplies. But that simple act became revolutionary because it revealed a fundamentally different worldview. Those women learned that the most dangerous weapon isn't bombs or bullets, it's truth. And truth emerges not from propaganda, but from experience, from seeing alternatives, from comparing what you're told with what you live. As one woman wrote in her memoir years later, "We were told Americans were beasts, but beasts don't provide sanitary napkins. Beasts don't care if prisoners have clean products for their monthly cycles. Beasts don't treat enemy women with dignity. We were lied to about the beasts. And in discovering that lie, we had to confront all the other lies too. The sanitary napkins were small, but the truth they revealed was enormous. If this story challenged your understanding of World War II, if it made you think differently about propaganda and truth, about dignity and humanity, then please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We bring you these untold stories every week, accounts that don't fit the simple narratives, that reveal uncomfortable truths, that show the complexity of human nature and human societies. Stories about how ordinary people on all sides of conflicts were manipulated by propaganda, how they broke free from those lies, how they learned to see humanity in enemies. These stories matter because propaganda hasn't disappeared. Every society, every political movement, every time period has its own versions. Learning to recognize it, learning to question it, learning to seek truth through experience rather than accepting what authority tells you, these skills are timeless. Subscribe and join us in exploring history that challenges assumptions and reveals truths. The stories of POWs, of civilians, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, who learned that the world was more complex than propaganda made it seem. Hit that subscribe button now and make sure notifications are on so you never miss these important stories. Thank you for watching. And remember, the greatest protection against propaganda is experience, comparison, and the courage to admit when what you've been taught is wrong. The German women at Camp Rustin had that courage. May we all find it when we need it.